Welcome to this lecture on different types of strength training, where we look at definitions and we look at how to practically apply it. So what are we going to cover in this lecture? We look at different types of strength training, and then we are defining different types of strength training, and that is going to be a little bit of a longer part. So I'm going to, if you're watching that on YouTube, I'm going to put something in the chapter so you can skip, because I will read out a couple of definitions. Follow it, or you skip to the practical part, which is then point number 3, the practical application. So for now, let's get started. Different types of strength. But before we get started, first things first, types of strength or forms of strength, strength qualities, expressions of strength are all synonyms. So essentially, they all mean the same thing. For now, I've decided to go with types of strength, and let's have a look at different types of strength. So when in doubt, ask the ultimate strength scientist, Isaac Newton. What do I mean with that? We had Isaac Newton in the first lecture, but what I really like is he said, if I've seen further than anyone else, it has been by standing on the shoulders of giants. And for this, now attention, DVD, death by definition. I'm going to read out a few definitions, but the idea is, let's have a look at some of the classical textbooks and how they define types of strength. And then we can make our conclusion of different types of strength and then how to apply it. Let's get started with death by definition. So we have types of strength from Bompa and Huff in the book Periodization. They categorize it in general strength, specific strength, strength speed, maximum strength, and muscular endurance. So basically 5 different types of strength. And the definition for general strength is general strength refers to the strength of the whole muscular system. Specific strength relates to the motor pattern of muscle groups that are essential to a sporting activity. Speed strength is the ability to develop force rapidly at high velocities. And maximum strength refers to the highest force the neuromuscular system can generate during a maximum voluntary contraction. And the last one in this here, muscular endurance is the ability of the neuromuscular system to produce force in a repetitive session over extended periods of time. The next one, strength qualities from the German Schmidt-Bleicher. I've translated it. So basically, in his classification, there are 4 expressions of strength, and that is maximal strength, absolute strength, speed strength, and strength endurance. Let's go through the definitions. The maximal strength is the highest value of strength produced through maximum voluntary contractions against an insurmountable resistance. Absolute strength describes the greatest possible strength which a muscle can produce based on the magnitude of its cross section. Speed strength defines the ability of the neuromuscular system to produce the greatest possible impulse in the shortest available time span. And speed strength encompasses 2 other qualities, which is starting strength and explosive strength. And starting strength defines the ability of the neuromuscular system to develop from 0 the greatest possible strength in the shortest possible time. And explosive strength refers to the ability of the neuromuscular system to continue developing the already started tension increase as fast as possible. So think about it, starting strength is from nothing, 0, creating the highest form of strength, and then explosive strength is the ability to maintain that. Strength endurance defines the ability of the neuromuscular system to produce the greatest possible performance. Next one, application of strength diagnosis from Rob Newton and Dugan. they look at 6 different fundamental strength qualities. And they say these qualities are maximum strength, high load speed strength, low load speed strength, rate of force development, reactive strength, and skill performance. Maximum strength, the highest force capabilities of the neuromuscular system produced during slow eccentric, concentric, and isometric contractions. High load speed strength, highest force capability of the neuromuscular system produced during dynamic, eccentric, and concentric actions under a relatively high load, greater than 30% of the max, and performed as rapidly as possible. Very often in the literature you find for this high load speed strength, as Rob Newton calls it, you also find strength speed as opposed to speed strength, which then is the next one, low load speed strength, the highest force capability of the neuromuscular system produced during dynamic, eccentric, and concentric actions under a relatively light load, smaller than 30% of the max, and performed as rapidly as possible. So very often you find also the expression of strength speed as well as speed strength. Strength speed being higher loads, trying to move it as fast as possible, and speed strength being lower loads, moving as fast as possible. We look at that later when we have a look at the force velocity curve, where these qualities fit on the force velocity curve. But for now, let's continue. Rate of force development, RFD, the rate at which the neuromuscular system is able to develop force, measured by calculating the slope of the force time curve on the rise to the maximum force of the action. Reactive strength, the ability of the neuromuscular system to tolerate a relatively high stretch load and change movement from rapid eccentric to rapid concentric. So the stretch shortening cycle and how to use the stretch shortening cycle, that is one of the fundamental qualities in the expression of reactive strength. Skill performance. Skill performance is the ability of the motor control system to coordinate the muscle contraction sequences to make the greatest use of the other 5 strength qualities we just outlined, such that the total movement best achieves the desired outcome. So essentially, skill performance encompasses all the 5 qualities that we previously outlined. Let's have a look. Strength, principles and practice of resistance training from Mike Stone, Max Stone and Bill Sands. They start, number 1, strength is the ability to produce force against an external resistance. And then they further subdivide strength into general strength, specific strength, absolute maximal strength, maximal voluntary strength, speed strength, reactive strength, strength endurance, absolute strength, relative strength. Let's go through that. General strength, the strength of the whole muscular system. Specific strength relates to the motor pattern of muscle groups that are essential to the sporting activity. Absolute maximal strength, the highest amount of strength that a muscle or muscle group can produce. Superimpose an electrical stimulation over MVC. MVC is the maximum voluntary contraction. So how much can voluntarily achieved? Most often that is measured under isometric conditions. We get into that in a few minutes. So against a fixed resistance, trying to exert as much force as possible, and then that is measured, and that is the MVC, maximum voluntary contraction. Maximal voluntary strength. Peak force developed during a maximal voluntary contraction, we just had that, and that can be further subdivided in the competitive maximum, the Cmax, and the training maximum, the Tmax. That becomes especially important for strength athletes, since they have a competition maximum, which is most often higher than the training maximum. So in training, they work at a different maximum than they have in competition. What does that mean? Well, imagine we looked at Lasha Talakadze, the Olympic weightlifter, in the previous lecture, and for example, applying this concept of competitive maximum, this athlete might have a competitive maximum of 220 in the snatch, but his training maximum might be only 205, as an example. Why is that? Because most often in competition, the athletes are peaking and they are capable of more than they are in training. So this idea of a competitive maximum and training maximum has been developed. Speed strength. The ability to develop force rapidly at high velocities. Reactive strength. The ability of the neuromuscular system to tolerate a relatively high stretch load and change movement from rapid eccentric to rapid concentric muscle action. Again, the stretch shortening cycle. And strength endurance, the ability of the neuromuscular system to produce force in a repetitive fashion. And absolute strength, the amount of force that can be generated regardless of body mass. And opposite to that, relative strength, the amount of force that can be developed relative to body mass. So again, if we take that example of Olympic weightlifting, it's a good example because they work with weight categories. For the Olympic weightlifter that we saw, Lasha Talakadze as an example, his absolute strength is higher than anyone else on the planet. But the relative strength, there might be athletes who have higher relative strength. Why is that? Because Lasha Talakadze lifts the heaviest absolute load, but also has a higher body weight. So then you can put the body weight into relation with the load lifted. But normally what you see at lower weight categories, that the relative strength is higher. The relative strength, the body weight put into relation to the weight lifted. So for example, the legendary Süleymanoglu, he's not with us anymore, but he was one of the first to be able to lift 3 times his body weight. So for a heavyweight Olympic weightlifter, that will not be possible. That will be much lower values. Moving on, types of strength from Bompa and Busicelli. And they look at different types of strength. They look at the relation to body weight, the degree of specificity, the force time curve, the muscle actions, and its qualities. Let's have a look. Strength, relation to body weight. Absolute strength and relative strength. We just had that. Absolute strength is an athlete's capacity to exert maximum force regardless of body weight, as opposed to relative strength is the ratio between maximum strength and body weight. I just outlined that in an example with the Olympic weightlifters. Degree of specificity, and there we have general strength, specific strength, and the so-called strength reserve. General strength is the foundation of the entire strength training program and should be the main focus of the first years of training. Specific strength takes into account the characteristics of the sport, such as ergogenesis, energy system contribution, the planes of movement, there are 3 different planes of movement, the prime movers, the joints, the range of motion, and the muscle action. And specific strength takes into account, as we said, characteristics of the sport such as ergogenesis, planes of movement, joints range, and muscle action. And the strength reserve is the difference between maximum strength and the strength required to perform a skill under competitive conditions. The force time curve. Let's have a look. We have starting strength, explosive strength, also called rate of force development. We have power and we have maximum strength. Starting strength is expressed at the start of concentric action and is usually measured at 50 milliseconds. Again, if you look through the literature, you find different values. Most often you find 50, but you also find 30 milliseconds as the measure for starting strength. Anyway, it's fairly short. 30 to 50 milliseconds is not a lot of time to express force. Explosive strength or rate of force development is the rate at which force increases at the beginning of a concentric movement. Yeah? So one is the time, 30 to 50 milliseconds, and the other one looks at the slope or the increase. Taken together, starting strength and explosive strength represents what we call power, or according to the authors, speed, strength. I've outlined that earlier. You might find different terminologies: power, speed, strength, strength, speed. Let's have a look at maximum strength. Maximum strength is the amount of force that an athlete can achieve in a movement. And then the next one, strength and muscle action. We have concentric strength, we have isometric strength, and we have eccentric strength. So concentric strength, in a concentric action, the muscle creates tension and shortens. Isometric. In an isometric action, the muscle creates tension without shortening or lengthening. Yeah? And eccentric, in an eccentric action, a muscle creates less tension than the external resistance and is therefore lengthening. And now we look at the last one, its qualities of strength. We have maximum strength, power, and muscular endurance. Maximum strength is the highest force that can be exerted by the neuromuscular system during contraction. Power is the product of two abilities, we had that, strength and speed, and is itself the ability to apply the highest force in the shortest period of time. And muscular endurance is the muscle's ability to sustain work for a prolonged period of time. Now we had all these definitions, but one thing is missing, huh? What about my gains? So, we didn't talk about how to build muscle mass. I have you covered. Brad Schoenfeld says in his book, The Science and Development of Muscular Hypertrophy, by definition, muscle hypertrophy is an increase in the size of muscle tissue. And now we get into the last set of definitions, and that is the science and practice of strength training from Kramer and Satsiowski. And I really like their approach of having goal-specific strength training. So it depends on what you want to achieve, and then you choose the type of strength training you want in order to achieve that goal. So we have strength performance, power performance, muscle mass, endurance performance, and injury prevention. And by definition, strength performance, the general idea with training experienced athletes is not to train strength itself as a unified whole. Rather, it is to train the underlying factors, both muscular and neural. We get into that in a few seconds. Power performance. In many sports, strength exercises are performed with the main objective to improve power or velocity of movement against a given resistance, and that could be body weight or an implement, rather than maximum strength itself. Yeah? So in most sports we have to propel our body weight forward. That was the example of the high jumper in the first lecture. Or we have to produce force in order to accelerate an implement. And there you can think of various examples, right? So the tennis player has to accelerate the tennis racket, the shot putter has to accelerate the shot. So different examples, the discus thrower has to accelerate the discus in order to throw it as far as possible. Yeah? Muscle mass. While muscle hypertrophy is a primary goal of bodybuilders, athletes do not typically aim at an increase in muscle mass. But then there is a second part to that definition. However, muscle hypertrophy is an important way to increase muscular strength. And that goes back to what we just said previously on performance, strength performance. Strength is produced through neural mechanisms as well as structural mechanisms. And these structural mechanisms are the structural mechanisms are the amount of muscle fibers and the size of the muscle fibers. So let's have a look. Muscle hypertrophy, important to increase muscular strength, and there's a quick fact. So if we look at the force capabilities of different muscle fiber types, and we have type 1 as the so-called quote-unquote slow twitch muscle fibers and the type 2 as the quote-unquote fast twitch muscle fibers, they can produce a different amount of force per cross-sectional area. Endurance performance. Endurance is defined as the ability to bear fatigue. Muscular endurance is typically characterized by the number of exercise repetitions one can carry out until failure, or by the time one can maintain a prescribed pace of lifts or posture. And the last one, injury prevention. Heavy resistance training results in both increased muscular strength and increased mechanical strength of the connective tissue structures around the joint. Strength training increases bone mineral content. A stronger muscle absorbs more energy than a weak muscle before reaching the point of muscle injury. This may be important to prevent injuries. And there's a continued part to that definition. To plan training routines to reduce the risk of injury is necessary to consider A, muscle groups and joint motions, B, muscle balance, and C, coordination patterns. Now we come to the end. What do we make with all of that information? That's what I said, death by definition. Let's have a look at the practical application of different types of strength. As we could see, most often we find somewhere in all the definitions maximum strength training, power training, hypertrophy training, and strength endurance training. But in my opinion, that is a little bit like putting the cart before the horse. Why is that? In the training course, the mini course on training principles, I had the lecture on the different approach to training principles, and in that I outlined the story of Prometheus. Prometheus was shackled to the cliff by Zeus because he stole the fire from Zeus, and every evening as a punishment an eagle came to pick out his liver, and overnight the body healed, and the next evening the eagle came again and picked out the liver again, and that cycle repeated over and over again. So again, what do you want to say with that, Christian? This story shows that the human body has an ability to adapt. And adaptation is the main law of training. Yeah? And as a recap, I just said, most often we find maximum strength, power, hypertrophy, endurance. But what's the adaptation we're chasing? Yeah? And therefore, I said previously, I really like the idea of Kramer and Satskyowski of having goal-specific strength training. So what does it all mean? I give you only 2 more quotes and then we get started with the more interesting stuff. So in the previous lectures, I've also outlined the idea to begin with the end in mind, coming from Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And to begin with the end in mind is one of the 7 habits. And basically it means to begin with the end in mind, to start with a clear understanding of your destination. It means to know where you are going so that you better understand where you are now, and so that the steps you take are always in the right direction. I'll get back to that in a second, yeah? And number 2, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication, from Leonardo da Vinci. So if we look at goal-specific strength training, to make it simple and to start with the end in mind, we can say our goal, we want to become stronger and we want to find the right strength training to achieve that goal. We want to become bigger, have more muscles, and we need to find the right way to train for that. We want to become faster or more explosive, or we want to endure longer. Not what you think in a sporting sense, we want to endure longer. And in the training course on training principles, I showed you a different approach to training principles. And in that course, I also outlined one of the most successful TED Talks of all times from Simon Sinek. And he came up with the idea of the what, the why, and the how. And I showed you how this what, why, and how applies to training principles. But we can use the same for our strength training practice. So there will be a what, a how, and a why. What is that, Christian? Bear with me, I explain it now. So the why is our training goal. We want to become stronger, we want to become bigger, we want to become more explosive, or we want to endure longer. And then what do we need to do? To become stronger, we need to do maximum strength training. To become bigger, we need to do hypertrophy training. To become more explosive, we need to do power training. And to endure longer, we need to do strength endurance training. Okay, that's all good, but how do we do it? This will be the topic of the next lecture when we look at how to do maximum strength training, how to do hypertrophy training, how to do power training, how to do strength endurance training. So for now, we looked at the different types of strength training. I gave you long definitions of different types of strength training. The idea really was I just wanted to show the commonalities between different authors outlining different types of strength. And we looked at the practical application, and we go more into detail in the next lecture when we look at strength training variables. I see you then.